Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Jamie McDonald. I'm the chair of the Information IRMS Property Group. And welcome, thank you for joining us tonight, coming along and joining this webinar. We've got a really interesting talk tonight from Ren on from Informal Solutions, and also the chair of the IRMS. And he's going to talk to us about creating an information governance hub, which is a subject really close to my heart at the moment, and getting that sorted. And I think it's a really interesting subject. We're going to do it as a presentation for the first half of the meeting, and then we're going to have a roundtable kind of discussion. So if you've got any questions, you can save them from there, or type in the chat, and we'll come back to them as we get to that point. But yeah, any questions, just ask, and we'll kick off.
Thank you. I think what we can do, because there's a relatively small number, is invite everyone on stage
yes, that's a good idea.
At the end. And I think the process is we can invite them and then we accept them. But we'll work that out when we get there.
Yeah.
So hello, everyone. To those that don't know me, my name is Reynold Leming. As Jamie kindly said, I'm chair of the IRMS. But actually, today I am here wearing my day job hat. Because the IRMS, all of us, Jamie, me, we all do this on a voluntary basis. So all have the day job. And I'm going to share the slides in a sec, but I'm here to speak about what we do a bit in my company, Inform Solutions Limited. So I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. Share that. We'll just see ourselves there. And now I'm going to whiz over to PowerPoint and go into present. And please shout anyone if you can't now see a PowerPoint slide saying what I'm going to be talking about today. And hello, Jamie.
Yep.
All right, you can hear me?
I can hear you.
I think I disconnected for a bit. Right.
Oh,
so
okay.
and you can see the PowerPoint.
Yeah, all okay.
Brilliant. All okay. Right. So I'm Ren. I'm managing director of a company called Inform Solutions Limited. Now, what we do is we're trying to create, hopefully unique, a blend of both facilities management and records management services and solutions. So that in so doing, we're trying to help people create the most optimal future of work, shall we say, the modern workplace, which combines both looking after facilities and the physical way that people work, but also records management and information governance, so looking after physical records, but also digitally how people work. And as a subset of that, we provide asset management solutions, both for facilities assets and information assets. And as a subset of that, which I'm going to be talking about today, we're offering what we call an information governance hub. So the next few slides will be talking about what I mean by that and what the purpose of one is, and will be illustrated by a few screenshots from our system. So I think we all know the expression an IAR, and we'll all know that possibly as an information asset register. And many organisations will quite rightly have an information asset register. But the concept of the Information Governance Hub is expanding the use of an information asset register to not only have that catalogue of what our physical records are and our data assets are, to be a broader information assurance register. So IAR meaning information assurance register in this context, which, as it says at the bottom, tells the story over time of the evidential history of what information has been maintained, how it was used and handled, and very importantly, why it was done in that manner, so that at any stage going back in the past that we've got such records, we can be accountable, fully accountable for how we governed information at that point in time. So what are the objectives of having such an information assurance register? Well, there's a key part, which is why many people have information asset registers, which is complying with GDPR, the UK GDPR now, and also relevant bits of the Data Protection Act 2018, which might, for example, mean being able to keep the Article and produce the Article 30 records processing activities, which might be to maintain the information that's needed to populate privacy notices, which might be maintaining records about legitimate interest assessments, records about the consents that are being gathered over time, etc. And that information would obviously be contained within an information assurance register. And a lot of that is about the data you record regarding information assets. Similarly, an information asset register is very useful for something like accrediting to the ISO 27001 Information Security Management System standard, where part of the evidence to produce for that is a record of information assets, and similarly compliance with other standards. So, for example, people working in the NHS, where they need to comply with what used to be the NHS IG toolkit, now I think called the Data Protection and Security Toolkit. Having an information asset register, both of data assets but also IT equipment, is important there as well. And as well as those pure compliance aspects, I think when you've got a well-populated information asset register, there's a lot of stakeholders in the organisation who all have an interest in that. Information governance staff will be very interested because it will tell them what information is held, in what format, how well it's managed, how well retention policies are applied or not, and what retention policies apply to which information sets. Facilities management colleagues will have an interest because they'll want to know, for example, where the paper records are, where they're stored, how much space that they're taking up, what cabinets and equipment, for example, are used to hold them as well. ICT staff will have an interest because they can see what systems are used across the organisation, where there might be little pockets to access databases still existing, where there's duplication of data that could be rationalised into main corporate systems. Staff in information or cybersecurity will have an interest because they'll want to know what the security conditions and controls are in the way that information is stored, and look for the risks and issues and gaps around that. And similarly, there'll be a whole range of staff who have interest in risk management, in legal matters, who work for internal audit, etc., who will all be interested in that core asset information. But as we look at the concepts of maintaining an information assurance register to produce that information governance hub, we'll see that there's a lot more that we're wanting to maintain, as well as purely just the asset data. And there's an importance to that, not just to the interest of some of these internal stakeholders, but because of the many scenarios an organisation might end up in where there's going to be external scrutiny of the way that information was held. Now, one of those could be public inquiries, for example. So we see there's ongoing public inquiries around things like Grenfell, contaminated blood. There was the historic abuse inquiries. There's a big inquiry coming with COVID, and those inquiries, and at any one time there's several going on, and there'll always be more on the horizon, have a broad reach, not just in the public sector, but also in the private and voluntary sectors as well, for the organisations that could be drawn in to give evidence. And those inquiries, as we've seen from some of those that I've mentioned, can go back many, many, many years in terms of the evidence we're looking for, which isn't only about being able to produce information, but it's also about being able to justify and describe and account for the way that information was managed at a point in time. Also, for example, if information isn't available, why it's not available, so that you can see if it was defensibly disposed of or not, based upon the procedures, policies, protocols and rules at the time. So maintaining that wider evidential history, and I'll be going into examples of what I mean by that, is all part of this information assurance concept. Similarly, if we look at insurance, many policies can have long tail claims, particularly if they're related to things such as health matters, or maybe things to do with defects in products and buildings. Again, there's the need to go back lengthy periods of time to either look for information or understand what information was or wasn't held and why at a particular point in time. And it'll be exactly the same with a range of audits and investigations, whether that's from the Inland Revenue or a sector regulator or the police or anyone who wants to investigate a matter. And similarly with litigation, where some limitation periods can go back lengthy periods of time. So, for example, if we look within the Limitation Act 1980, and there's a 15-year limitation from the point a property defect was noticed, so that for property alone, there can be litigation that looks back at records that go many, many years into the past. And for all these scenarios, of course, once they become public, journalists can come looking. And again, we need to have that information evidence-based for when we're liaising with journalists and as part of our public relations response to any of the above. So what is this evidence that I'm talking about in this Information Governance Hub, in an Information Assurance Register? Well, as we can see on the second and third bullets, absolutely fundamental to this is the information asset record and certain data that we'll hold about business processes, which will be very important, for example, for producing our Article 30 records processing activities. But there's a whole range of other things that I've itemized here, and I won't run through every bullet in turn. But for example, I was mentioning earlier that we needed to be able to say, if we didn't hold information at a point in time, why not? We need to look at defensible disposition. And that, for example, is looking at the retention policies that we had in place at a certain time and what their rationale and scope was. And then looking below on the information asset, it's a whole mixture of information about the way we handled stuff, whether that's hardware, whether that's software, and the governance mechanisms we had in place, whether that's documentation like policies, whether that's a record of the assessments we've done like data protection impact assessments. And it's saying at a summary level, we can create this holistic record and a history of changes to it over time to have this accountable record of our information assurance. So how do we do that? Well, as I mentioned a number of times, maintain an information assurance register. And what we're going to see now is a set of slides with screenshots, and this comes from our InformU system. So what we've got here is a card that gives a porting view that gives a snapshot of a particular topic and the relevant items, information governance items that support that. So if we look at the top here, we've got something called a ROPA process. So in this view, I've said the way I want to collate and collect stuff, the collection will be a record of processing activity process. So I'll have a business process, particular business process. In this case, if you can see it, relating to supplier correspondence. And I'll have some descriptive details around that. And then under that, I will tag to it and collate everything that I believe is important to the history of how that was governed from an information perspective. So this is just a snapshot, but for example, there we can see we've got a relevant agreement, a contract with a third-party lawyer. We can see access to the summary of the relevant data protection impact assessment that we did on that process. And we can see the first three items for electronic data that we hold as information assets, in this case, that relate to that process. Retention policies are very important. We want to maintain a record not only of the retention policies in their detail, but also what information they were applied to over time, and also ask a question around not only is this a theoretical retention policy, but was it practically implemented and what measures were taken to actually apply it to the real world information. And this screen is one from the retention policy management bit of the system. So it shows the policy, and then beneath that, 4 main sections. So the first section is where it says what jurisdiction it's for. So if you're in a multinational organisation, you can have more than one jurisdiction with different policies in each. And also its application to a business classification scheme with business functions, activities, any sub-activities, etc. And then the concept is when you tag an asset into the relevant level of the business classification scheme, it can automatically inherit the relevant retention policy. So this is a retention policy here for financial transactions, and it's mapped into the finance function and both the accounts payable and the accounts receivable activities. Then got information about the policy. So what's the scope? What's the minimum retention period? In this case, financial year close plus 6 years. And what's the default final action, which in this case is destroyed. It could be review or could be to transfer to another institution. The next bit is interesting because it's about saying, do we want to continuously review this? So when you define an information asset, typically that's static in an asset register. As long as you're using that type of information for that activity, you'll maintain that asset over a period of time. But what the review cycle says is, do I periodically, for example, annually, want the information asset owner or information asset administrator relating to that asset to be prompted to think about, according to the retention policy, is there a chunk of that stuff physically or digitally out in the real world that I actually want to dispose of, and then record that in the audit trail. And last but not least, at the bottom, there's something called link citations. So very important to be able to justify at a point in time when a retention policy was in place, what was the legal, what was the regulatory, what was the business rationale for determining that policy. But also, for example, if a law changes, if the Limitation Act changes, or a financial law or a health and safety law changes, that you can use this to look at the impact of that change on your retention policies and on all the data that's affected by it. Business processes. So if we think specifically about GDPR and data protection compliance, such as the records of processing activities, that asks you to produce an information set at what they call in the GDPR the purpose of processing as a data controller, and the purpose is typically going to be a business activity. So there's information in that record set that you want to describe at the business activity level. So that's, for example, in the system, you can set up fields that say, have I done my data flow mapping for this? What's my role in this process? Am I a controller, a processor, a joint controller, etc.? What's my overall DPIA status for this process? And record other high-level information, for example, about the personal data that's handled. However, the ROPA, to me, will always be a combination of process-level information and asset information, because a business process will typically have several information sets that make it up, that are maintained for it. Each of those information sets will be its own asset across different formats, across different locations, having slightly different characteristics. And the devil will be in the detail at the asset level around things like retention, around things like the lawful basis of processing, around things around information security measures. So the ROPA actually is drawing together both process level information and information relating to the relevant assets. But you still need to have entities in the system that describe what happens at the business process. And as we saw in that reporting card view earlier, the process is a good way to collate all the other relevant bits of your assurance record beneath it. By the way, everything you're seeing in the system is not hard-coded. We're not saying this is the way you have to do it. It's completely configurable in terms of setting up asset types, field names, drop-down lists, etc. So now we move on to the information asset, and I've just put in a few screenshots because there's umpteen bits of information. Some people I've spoken to want to record 40, 50 different bits of information about an information asset. So I've just put in a few snapshots. Here in the top left, this is a view for a physical record where you might want to define what type it is, the actual physical location. On the right is a view of the GDPR or data protection related fields that you only populate if something contains personal data. So it goes into the details at the asset level around like which data subjects does this pertain to? What's the category of personal data? What's the business rationale for processing? What's the Article 6 legal basis, etc. And then if we look to the bottom left, the other thing we want to do with this system is to keep it evergreen. So for each asset or indeed other type of record, for that thing, you can have an audit trail log of ongoing business events. So if you do something regarding that entity, you can record that as an activity in its audit trail log. So we've got an example drop-down list here where for an asset, you might have disposed of a chunk of it, scanned a chunk of it, sent a chunk of it to storage, shared a chunk of it with a third party, migrated it from one system to another, etc. So you can maintain this ongoing audit trail of the activity and business events related to your information over time. Software. Now, for things like NHS Toolkit compliance, for things like ISO 27001 record keeping, what they define as an information asset is bigger than just the data. It's things like software, equipment, IT services, even people. So it's important to be able to keep a log and inventory of the software solutions you use, but it's also important from an ongoing information assurance point of view as well. Because if I look back in time and want to justify how information was managed and that it was managed properly, part of that evidence is not just what the data was, but the software platform that it sat on, and any record that you have around the time spans that that piece of software was used to process that data, any risks, concerns, issues, major upgrades, etc. that happened, so that you can justify now how that data was managed then in terms of things like its integrity, its authenticity, its security, etc. And for IT staff now as well, it provides a life cycle management and asset management tool as well. So you can see who your suppliers are, what the license terms are, when license renewal is up, etc. And there's a similar point of view to take with equipment as well. So I've given an example here where you might put in a record relating to a document scanner. Because if you've got a data asset that is a digital asset that contains scanned image records, you might, as part of this assurance history, want to go back in time and say, well, what was the equipment used to scan it at the time? Were there any maintenance issues? What was the maintenance regime? So that, again, the overall justification around the trust in the integrity and the authenticity of those scanned images comes from having the history log as well of the equipment used in that digitization process. Assessments, and there's a variety of information governance assessments that you might undertake, but a key one obviously for personal data, and so much information contains personal data, is the data protection impact assessment process. Now, the system isn't as such a workflow automation tool for that process, and we work with a solution called DAPIAN, D-A-P-I-A-N, which is available actually on a discounted basis to IRMS corporate members. That will do that automation of the data protection impact assessment process. But what we do is say, at the end of that, to put a summary record in the information assurance solution, because that's part of the overall evidential history. Documentation. This is a huge part of the evidential history, because it's what governed and stated and instructed on the way things are done. So it's having a summary record that says this is the status of things like policies and standards and procedures and guidelines and strategies, and even job descriptions for roles such as the DPO or the CIRO. This is what documentation we had in place at what time, and if it's still there, this is where the master copies are stored, and this is how it's published, and any meta information around the handling of that documentation as well. Risks and incidents, another part of that overall assurance picture. So again, this is where you may well have a system that deals with live incident management, information's fed perhaps into corporate risk management systems as well. But what we're saying is take the summary record of what's happened in terms of things like risks and errors, adverse incidents, near misses even, and have that as part of the overall assurance picture and catalogue here the key information. Now, obviously, this can be used as well for live risk management. You can manage risk status. You can change actions, and the system in the background does maintain an audit trail of that. And there's a full reporting tool, of course, with the system as well. Contracts, this is the last slide with the picture on it from the system. So we may be working regularly with third-party agencies and have information sharing agreements with them, or we may be contracting out certain aspects of data processing related to marketing information or payroll information or something like that to a third party and have data processing agreements with them. So just as we have a register of things like policies and procedures, it's also providing that register of those contracts and information sharing agreements that we have in place with third parties, because again, that is part of our proof of how information and arrangements around the handling of information were governed at a point in time. So as an end note, we have a picture there showing, because the system's all driven by buttons to press to move around, a system showing a snapshot from the Add Assets tab of the different kinds of things we've been looking at today. And as an end note, it's having that history, the ability to approve good practice over time in the use of handling information is that sum of all those different aspects of how it was processed and governed over time. So I'm going to say thank you very much for listening to this bit. I'm going to return to the main screen and hopefully we can move to conversation. So Jamie, that was all visible and everyone heard me, I hope.
Yes, it was all visible for me, and thank you very much, Ren. That was really interesting, and really thank you so much for running through those slides with us and explaining it for us. Yeah, so I think what we'll do now, as I say, is open up to questions, and because there's only a few of us, I think maybe we'll add everyone to the floor, and then we can.
Oh, there is chat.
And we can
Can
chat.
You do that? You know what?
I think I can. I think I'll just check if I click on the 3 buttons next to people's name. If you don't want to join the chat, then please let me know and I won't add you. I won't invite you to the stage, but I will do otherwise. So I'm inviting everyone now.
Oh, I've got to do it all again for Scott because he's just arrived. Scott, I can send you the slides.
Oh, so not everyone can join.
Not going to join while you're recording.
Oh,
no.
Not everyone can join the stage, unfortunately, it seems.
Because not everyone wants to at the moment.
It says invitation not available. So maybe we have to go old school and just put it into the chat book.
Well, what I'll do is I'll invite everyone to join on stage. You don't have to accept.
That's what I was having. Invitation.
Oh, invitation not available. I can invite young Scott. Melissa's getting ready, but yeah.
Well, I'll ask a question to begin with then, if I may. Obviously, I think this is great because it replaces all the disparate Excels all over the place that people have typically an organisation, you know, recording this kind of information in separate places, doesn't it? You know, we've all experienced it. And I suppose it's, in doing that, is it good to do this kind of thing on a kind of replacing one at a time kind of thing, or going all at once? You know, is it a slow burner to do, or a big bang?
Yeah, and it's a good question, Jamie. The starting point for this is, where does the heavy lifting in any project like this lie? And the heavy lifting in any project like this lies in getting the data into such a system. So whether you want to big bang it or start in different areas will be dependent on the data quality, typically in a spreadsheet, of the existing information. Because all too often that information, people will look at it and say, well, actually, as part of implementing a system, there's some changes I want to make. I want these new fields in the system. I haven't necessarily asked those questions. I need to do some amalgamation of stuff or splitting out of stuff in my spreadsheet. So if the data can all be got into a good quality at the start, then absolutely put it all in at once, because then you get the benefit of that overall holistic picture at the end, and the features and functionality are all the same.
And I suppose then it is also making sure that that data is the best you can get. So is it worth doing a kind of tidy up beforehand? You know, doing a kind of, rather than pulling in inconsistent data.
Yeah.
You know, doing a kind of rationalization process. You know, determining the same terminology. For example, you know, I experienced it in organisations where different, in the same organisation, different teams use different terms when they mean the same thing. Yeah. So it's making sure that you know, that is done.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple of questions there. I'll pick up on Scott first. Yeah. Yes. So big bang if you want to get all types of data in, but absolutely right. Work with the team first, as with all solutions, to pilot it, because you've got to pilot not only the basic use of the system, but the use cases around it. So what sort of activities do you want to record in the ongoing audit trail? What sort of reports are most valuable? So work with the pilot area to make sure all that information. Stop sharing the screen. Yes. There we go. Disable sharing. How about that? Maybe that's why people couldn't come on stage.
Oh, maybe. Yeah, sorry.
I've disabled it now. Josephine's asked, can this work in Microsoft 365? No, it's a separate cloud-based system to Microsoft 365. Oh. It's showing full names and emails earlier, so you're going to have to edit the video. Okay, we'll remember that for Rob.
Thank you, Melissa. We'll remember that. Yeah. So I suppose if you're looking at departments or functions to start, if you're going to do starting off kind of guinea pig, you'd want to look at departments that have that kind of standardized kind of easy structure kind of thing, maybe like finance or something, where you've got an easy way to aggregate that information down, or as Scott just says, HR, that it's a bit easier to do that with. Whereas if you've got to get the buy-in.
And the main way you'll work with this, it depends on the roles and responsibilities infrastructure that you've got. So let's say you are an organisation that already has information asset owners appointed, and you've got role descriptions for them documented, and maybe that second level of an information asset administrator or whatever they're called, or information leads. These are the people who are going to own the stuff that's gone in the system. They'll be tagged as the owners. So you'd work perhaps, yes, in a pilot area, but it's also saying there's a specific community of people that you're working with, because these people will already have documented in their role descriptions, probably maintaining an information asset register. So extending that to a fuller governance assurance register could well be part of that same responsibility. And they'll have a direct interest in making sure that information is maintained and up to date.
And I suppose it does also, it it allows for information owners to be told or to be informed of what of when or how they need to action something.
Yeah.
Whereas, rather than do a yearly email, or other way of doing it from a records manager or something or IT team, it allows that kind of automation or that through the plugin that you say, or other way, just so it's more controlled and it's standardized, which I think is benefit to anyone, because it can easily just be forgotten otherwise.
Yeah, and it's a tool for engagement. You're absolutely right. So let's look at records retention aspects, for example. Yes, you can produce the best, the most comprehensive records retention schedule you wish, but unfortunately, that PDF can stay on what I call the dusty intranet shelf all too easily, and people won't go and look it up. But if you have a register, for example, of information assets, and as part of the process of maintaining that register, you specifically as an asset owner have to tag it to a retention policy, you've done a couple of things. Firstly, you've gone through the thought process of saying, what is the real world group of stuff that I'm applying retention to, rather than the theory that's described in the schedule. And secondly, you've gone through the engagement of actually working out what that retention policy is, answering the next questions, which will be about thinking about how am I actually applying it? Am I applying it? What issues do I have? So it engages people more at the coalface of working with information, with their practical roles and responsibilities around things like retention, but then also disposal practices and storage practices and other things like that.
And with the retention, do you envisage it being, or I imagine it could be both, but big bucket or really granular? It's whatever someone chooses.
Whatever someone chooses. Now, the theory we've taken is to bring together a retention policy, a business classification scheme, and a chunk of stuff we'll call an asset, and that you map retention into the BCS, and then the asset inherits the retention through the BCS. Now, the depth of a classification scheme can be as small as big as you wish, but even if you've got, should we say, a large and more complex classification scheme, you can still have a small number of retention policies because you can map one policy many times. And I think the world is trying to move towards bigger bucket, but
eventually. Eventually, yes. Do we have any more questions out there for the...
Or comments or thoughts about anything related?
Oh, we've got a question coming from Anne. Can you see that, Ren?
Nor a culture of... Yeah, how would you counter that? Again, I suppose it depends. If an organisation doesn't yet have the information asset owners, there might be some other related roles like records management coordinators or something that you could leverage to the same extent. If not, then it's a matter of appointing someone who can take responsibility for the information they're owning, which might be like a team leader, for example. If they don't have an IAR yet, then it's a great idea to get one. But what you can do is populate it over time. So say, I really am interested, first of all, just to get in the landscape of what those information assets are and asking just the key questions. And then once that's there, perhaps revisit it at a second stage to say, right, now let's identify what contains personal data and capture the key information that we need, for example, for GDPR compliance. And then maybe at a third stage, go deeper into asking more questions about the physical localities of it or the IT storage localities over it, and take fairy footsteps towards the ultimate goal, and over time collate all that other information about the policies, about the equipment, about the agreements, about DPIAs, etc.
And I suppose doing that way with that staged engagement, and I imagine you include a lot of communication in that. That's why communicating what you're doing, how it works, and that would build up that engagement, and teams would see the value and understand more as it goes through time.
Yeah, absolutely, because you can cascade education out with that as a process, and in fact use the drive to populate something like this as a major stream of that training, communications and awareness raising. Josephine's asked, can we combine a retention policy and guidances together? I'll probably ask Josephine to type just a little bit more context to that, but in the system, when you establish a policy, there's a lot of information around that policy, about what that policy actually means, what the scope of it is, what the expected end of life activity is, be it destroy, review, transfer, etc. In the system as well, around each field of information, you can explode out contextual help text or advisory text as well. I'm not sure if that's actually answering the question though, Josephine. Or if it's a question around documentation, I think often I've seen policies, records management policies, where the actual retention schedule is an annex, so there's a contiguous read.
Yep.
Can you change the retention periods to implement other retention changes, etc.? So there's a separate record type for a retention policy, and system, as with all systems, if something changes, a log in an audit trail is kept of that change. But the vision, I mean, not so much talking about our system, but the vision for me in applying retention is to say, we know what information we held at a point in time. We know what the policy that was applied to that information at a point in time was, when that policy started to be applied, when that policy ended to be applied, and we know what the legal basis and rationale for that policy was. So that if someone comes into an organisation, we can not only say, well, this is how we govern the retention of something now, but if they say, well, 10 years ago, I want to know why something was disposed of, it's having that, and this is not systems much, but the overall concept of what I mean by an information governance hub is being able to go back a period of time and legally justify the practices that took place 10 years ago to say, this is why we still hold the information, or this is why we didn't hold the information, or this is our best evidence for why we never held the information in the first place. And also, sorry, on retention policies, the vision is to say, not only do we know what retention policies were applied to what at any one time and the history of change to those policies, but also the authorizations and approvals that were in place to make those changes. So if we changed the policy because we decided that a different law was applied or something, or we reinterpreted a law, we maintain the evidence for how that decision was made as well.
Excellent. Excellent. Very good. Has anyone else got any questions? Any comments?
I'm not quite sure the order of these messages, so hopefully, Scott, I have answered your question, but say yay or nay.
I saw the thumbs up, so I thought it was a.
Yeah. Thumbs up, indeed. Yeah. And yeah, I think that's a really good use case. So I'm not saying necessarily use our system for that. It's more focusing on the use case to use whatever systems or whatever record keeping approaches there are to have that audit trail of change of governance and applicability of governance over time.
And it's the audit trail is the thing we always must remember, isn't it? It's very easy to get caught out by making changes and just there's no evidence of why or how it was done, and it just it comes back to bite us if not managed correctly.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great big jigsaw to play with around those audit trails as well, which is why I include job descriptions in the theory of what you could have here, because you could say, well, I'm trying to defend a decision that was made by this role, the CIRO, DPO, the Caldecott Guardian, 5 years ago, and there might be argument as to whether it was their responsibility to do so.
Yeah.
So if you've got tagged in as well the job description, the role description as it was at the time, then you can sort of thread back and build your evidential jigsaw from all those bits and pieces.
Oh, yeah, I think that's a really good point, because job titles change, and people you need to know at what point.
Yeah.
And if that person has succeeded at that job title along the line, then at least they know that they should still be responsible for that, or it was responsible for that at a point in time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And it's similar with the equipment, which is why I sort of stress that a bit around the software and the hardware. It's often a forgotten cousin in this. But if, for example, you are talking about things like the integrity and authenticity of information and questioning it, why it is in the way it is, that's in large part reliant on the controls that were in place for a particular bit of kit or a particular software system at the time as well.
Yeah, and I suppose you can separate this out into the separate kind of functions. So you'd have like the facilities area with what they needed, for their assets, for both physical and digital. I suppose as well for facilities, like I say, with the printers, it's good to see that chain of when it was installed, when it was checked out, and when it was destroyed, and how it was destroyed, so that you can say that we know anything that was scanned on this scanner has gone, and we can prove it.
That's it. And yeah, I guess really mostly what today's about, although should we say illustrated by an example of our software doing it, but really it's about the thought process and the fun of the thought process. To think of all these what ifs, what makes the picture? What are all the different components that will make that picture on the front of my jigsaw, called information assurance over time?
Yeah.
So the printer is not just what printers we were doing, but what was the maintenance history, what's the history of any issue we might have had that we can trace back to perhaps a question we still have about the integrity of a certain record.
Yeah. Holistically.
Yeah.
I like that word, holistically.
Great word.
It's a great word.
Great word.
It's a great word.
Yeah.
I don't think no more questions have come in the questions or the chat. I haven't got any more to ask. Unless anyone else has got anything they want to ask now. Otherwise, hold your peace. Oh, Scott is typing. Oh.
Oh, no worries.
No worries at all. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, sorry for keeping the thing on earlier and then going back to this.
We'll sort that
but
out.
I'm sure everything will be sorted out in the recording.
But I'd just like to say,
Rob does a very good job on that.
I'd just like to say again, big thank you to Ren for coming to talk to us today or this evening, and thank you all for coming along and joining the meeting. I forgot to say at the start, this is the Property Group's first virtual meeting, and our first meeting of 2021. And it's been a pleasure to present you all and see you all here and hopefully answer your questions.
Thank you, everyone. Anne, Melissa, Scott, Josephine, everyone else. Thank you very much. Love being here talking about this stuff. As I say, thank you for watching. Yes, I did illustrate it with my system, but actually this is more about the theory of a concept, no matter how it's achieved.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Brilliant. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ren. And
thank you.
See you all soon.
See you all soon. Have a lovely evening.
Bye.
Bye.